Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me all properly, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the NERPS webinar series on peace and sustainability in the context of global change. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dalia Simangan, Associate Professor at Hiroshima University and one of the core members of NERPS, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. If you're new to this series and if you're not familiar with our organization, NERPS, or the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, is based here at Hiroshima University and serves as a global network of and also an information hub for collaborative research on the peace sustainability nexus. And with leading experts as invited guest speakers, the webinar sessions serve as a platform for us to rethink and update our knowledge or our understanding of peace and sustainability, especially amid global transformations. At this point, we're supposed to have a brief welcome remarks by our NERPS director, Professor Shinji Kaneko, but unfortunately, he cannot join us today, but he extends his gratitude to all of you for participating in this webinar and always supporting the activities and initiatives of NERPS. Also, I'd just like to inform everyone that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared through our website and social media accounts. For our attendees, if you have questions anytime, you can type them in the chat box or in the Q&A anytime during the webinar, but please include your name and affiliation together with your question. If you want to ask the question yourself, please use the raise hand function and I will enable your microphone so you can speak directly or you can ask your question directly to the webinar. I'm sure that the concepts that we will hear today are not just of interest to academics or the business sector, but of course to the broader society given our shared environmental challenges. So please do not hesitate to share with us your thoughts, your reflections, your questions at any point during this webinar. This is the 22nd installment of our series, and the topic of today's webinar is exploring unexpected collaboration to advance biosphere stewardship. Our speaker is Professor Henrik Österblom, a professor of environmental science with a research focus on human cooperation. He's also the chair of the Natural Capital Partnership Committee, Stanford University, chairman of the SeaBOS Fundraising Foundation, and board member of Race for the Baltic Fundraising Foundation. He has served as team leader, deputy science director, and science director at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. But starting from 2023, this year, he is on part-time leave from the Stockholm Resilience Centre to start up the Anthropocene Laboratory at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. He has a master's degree in behavioral ecology from Uppsala University and a PhD in marine ecology from Stockholm University. Henrik, thank you so much for your time today and welcome to our NERPS webinar. You may now start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Really nice to meet you, and thanks for organizing this webinar, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to listen to this talk about what my colleagues and I have been up to almost for the last decade, I think. And thanks also for reminding me of spring and Japan with that nice little video looking at the hanami. This is the middle of winter in Sweden. It's pitch dark when you go to work and it's pitch dark when you go home. So it's a horrible time. So it's nice to have some spring here. I'll share my slides and and my talk will be about half an hour. And like you said, Dalia, if anyone has any questions or want to interrupt me, just type that in the chat and I'll make sure that everyone's with me and that there are no confusions along the way, hopefully, or at least we'll try our best to make sure we avoid any confusions. Okay, so the title then is Unexploring Unexpected Collaboration to Advance Biosphere Stewardship. And I will tell you a little bit about why this collaboration may be unexpected and what it has resulted in. But I think, first of all, what is biosphere stewardship? One could ask. And then just at the bottom there, these are the two affiliations that I had when I did most of this job. I guess I should probably also include Tokyo University, because I've done quite a bit of work in this regard also in Tokyo, and I've been fortunate to be able to spend quite a bit of time there. So the biosphere basically is this thin layer of life that surrounds the planet. It's all the plants, all the animals, and also it's us, humans. We're part of the biosphere, and it's just a thin layer of life, 2 kilometers or 20 kilometers wide, with where there is life. It's the only part in the universe where we know that there is life, and we as humans we reshape and change this biosphere from the local to the global scales, and this sort of fundamental impact that we are having on the function and the structure of the entire planet is sometimes called the Anthropocene, the age of humanity, where we are sort of fundamentally rechanging the conditions of life. And the biosphere and the Anthropocene, those concepts have been developed over many decades, but it's really becoming increasingly clear that we as humans are fundamentally dependent on this capacity of the biosphere to sustain and support the development of societies. We can't just treat the environment as an externality. We really need to take care of this biosphere for our long-term sustainability. I'm sure most of you are aware of this and know of it, but it's just nice to illustrate the concept that the biosphere is not the environment out there, it's actually us, ourselves. So taking care of the biosphere is taking care of ourselves. This talk would focus on a particular aspect of the biosphere, and that's the ocean system. The ocean, of course, is an enormous resource for the planet, and if you're based in Japan, you have, I'm sure, quite a substantial relationship with the ocean. But I mean, globally, it provides food for billions. It takes up 90% of the excess heat in the climate system. So it really serves as an incredibly important function for sustaining the planet in a relatively stable state in relation to emissions of greenhouse gas emissions and increasing temperatures. It covers 70% of the surface of the Earth. And it's not just lots of really interesting resources for food, but it's also a space where transport and energy and tourism and innovation is taking place. So it's clearly a hugely important resource for societies and for economies and for livelihoods. But what we also know then in this Anthropocene ocean, as a result of human activities, water is getting warmer and more acidic. Sea levels are rising and currents are shifting. Ice is melting and animal populations are declining. And some of the food we eat, in particular in the Baltic Sea that is right next to where I live here in Sweden, pollution levels are so high. So if you have an intention to have children, basically, if you're a reproductive woman, you shouldn't eat food from the ocean more than a few times a year even. So it's horrible the way we have been sort of decreasing the quality of our food just by emissions of toxins, and as a result also of emissions of pollution, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus emissions from nitrogen. We have increased changes in production of the ocean, so you have these dead zones expanding. So we're not treating the ocean very well, despite the fact that they are so important to us. So in a project together with a number of colleagues from around the world, it was a project that was called NERPS, Predicting the Future Ocean, and funded by the Nippon Foundation, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan. We were tasked to come up with scenarios for the future of the ocean, working with climate scientists and ecosystem modelers. And our job was to think of what's the future management of the ocean. And what we did in that context was not just think about modeled scenarios for possible futures. We also thought that could we as scientists possibly be part of shaping the future of the ocean, or at least develop an understanding of who is it that is actually shaping the ocean and should be shaping it. And our focus was on not on all the ocean sectors, but we were really particularly interested in the fishery sector. And we realized that the fishing industry has such an enormous impact on ocean ecosystems and their future. But despite the fact that many of us had worked with this environment for the last 20 or 30 years, we had no idea who these actors were. So in 2012, a couple of colleagues and we started to develop a mapping of industry actors for global seafood production. And in the back of this graph here, you see the annual revenue of the 160 largest companies here. Oh, sorry. Here are the largest companies here in the back of the slides, where you have some of the really large companies here making revenues in the order of $8 or $6 billion. And then you see a declining trend of revenues over the different companies here. And what we wanted to do was look at the largest actors here, so the biggest part of this curve, to understand more about these global players. And since we were ecologists, we were really interested in the concept of keystone species. And these species are animals that have a disproportional impact on the structure and function of ecosystems. And we were wondering, in the Anthropocene, in this globally connected world that we are now living in, are there similar keystone actors that have a disproportionate effect on sort of the functioning of the planet? And if that's the case, how big and how important are they? So looking at revenues was the first step. And here we had a good idea of the sort of the curves of the different sizes of the companies. And these little green triangles here, those are just the revenues from 2007, and these green ones are the revenues in 2012, just to illustrate that there is an increase in revenues and a consolidation in the industry, so the larger companies are getting larger. But we did not want to know only the companies' names and the money they were making. We wanted to know how big are they when it comes to production volumes, what species are they catching, from what regions, and what kind of political powers do these companies have to actually shape the future. As you can see, these are companies from East Asia and Europe and North America, and they're involved in wild capture fisheries and fish farming, aquaculture, and feeds production for fish farm. So they are all over the place, but it was difficult for us to know who they were because the industry is not very transparent. But anyway, after about 2 years of interviewing experts and reading lots of reports and speaking to different regional management organizations and basically collecting information from all kinds of different sources, we were eventually able to produce this map where we illustrate that these 13 companies that we looked at, they produced 11 to 16% of the global catch, and in some regions up to 40% of the largest and most valuable stocks of fisheries. So for instance, the Peruvian anchovy here is the largest wild capture fisheries in the world, and 3 of these 13 companies, they produce 24% of that. They control 24% of that quota. Same thing, Alaska pollock, the second largest fishery in the world at that time. 4 of the companies produce 40% of that stock. So wherever you look, these blue ones are wild capture stock fisheries, the yellow ones are farmed fish, and then the pink one, the purple ones here are feeds. So wherever we looked in the seafood production, we realized that these companies are powerful and influence a quite large proportion of these animals, which in turn influence the ecosystems in which they operate. So we thought that maybe these are keystone actors. We realized that they're dominating global production revenues and volumes. They also control these different segments of seafood production. And one segment, for instance, is whitefish or small pelagics or salmon farming. So it's different parts of the seafood system. They were the big actors, regardless of which part of the system we looked at. We also realized that even though they are just 13 companies, combined they have more than 900 subsidiaries. So they work all over the world and they connect different regional places to their headquarters and also to global markets. So they really connect these ecosystems globally through markets and through the subsidiaries. And we also found that they really are instrumental in influencing global governance processes and institutions. They are on the national delegations to negotiations for tuna. They have been the founding members of certification bodies. So really they are sort of not just biological and financial powers, but they also have quite substantial political powers. So we thought with these criteria, we could define them as keystone actors. And we were interested to understand, well, how are they then using these powers that they have, or how could they use those powers? So in this paper, which we published in 2015, we draw the conclusion that if these companies were to engage in sustainability leadership, that can result in chain reactions or cascading effects throughout the entire seafood industry and help move towards improved management of marine living resources and ecosystems. Sorry. So this is like a conclusion that this could possibly be the case. But then we realized that this could actually be interesting to explore. So what if we treat this as a hypothesis instead, and see if we can design an experiment to see if there's any support for this hypothesis. So we were a bit lucky because the seafood industry in 2015 was characterized by multiple crises influencing the industry. There were big reports on labor abuse, primarily as a result of investigative journalism uncovering horrible working conditions in Thai fisheries. Illegal fisheries were also a challenge and had been for a long time, but was still on people's agenda. And there was also very widespread overuse of antibiotics in the industry and in seafood farming. At the same time, the UN SDGs are being published and start to describe this wider context of sustainability that needs to be addressed combined, not just one thing at a time, but you really need to look at the big picture. And the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, COP21 was an important sort of push further for advancing these issues. So during this time, and with this information that we had collected on the companies, a colleague of mine started to find time and place to interact with some of the CEOs of these companies. We thought that if we can get the CEOs interested in a conversation on sustainability and engage them in leadership, that would be interesting. So this little network graph that you have in this figure illustrate the two little green scientists and the connections that we were starting to make across the industry, and each color here is a different company. So we went to Korea, to Japan, to Norway, to other places to have informal conversations with the CEOs where we asked them, what are the problems that you're unable to solve for yourself, but that you could possibly solve if you were able to work with the other largest seafood industries in the world and with science? And we got some interesting ideas and some interesting suggestions. And after, it basically took us 2 years. We started this before the paper was published. It took us 2 years to convince 8 of the companies that it would be a good idea to meet and have a conversation about if they could work together and if they could engage in some kind of an experiment, if you will, with us to see if they were powerful enough to change the conversation in the industry. So after these informal bilateral conversations, where we were able to build sort of some first relationships and trust, we had a dialogue in 2016 in the Maldives, where we were offered an opportunity to be hosted by a resort there, where we had presentations from the science on the sort of the Anthropocene challenge. We had lots of background material produced on the specific sustainability challenges in seafood, and we had 5 CEOs represented at this meeting, and we had an additional 3 individuals from the other 3 companies. So together 8 companies were also able to provide their perspectives on the challenges, the way they saw them. So it was an opportunity to learn together, and it was an opportunity to realize that these problems are fundamental, and if the seafood industry doesn't do their share to help take care of these resources, they don't have a business at all. So it's really in their interest to sustain the ocean and to work with each other and to work with science. At this meeting, we also had the UN SDG ambassador, Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden, who were participating and who has been a very strong advocate for these companies to take on a larger responsibility. So she was also very key for convincing the companies that this is a good idea. So a few days at this resort and lots of conversations that we thought would maybe end up in a decision to possibly meet again. But we were really quite surprised when we realized that the companies are really committed to doing this with us. And we formulated an agenda as a result of this meeting that was signed by all the participating CEOs, which basically said that we are now going to address all the key challenges in seafood. And you can see the words highlighted here on some of the key things that they agreed to work on. Again, I said it's a very untransparent business, so they really wanted to work to advance transparency and improve traceability so that they could understand what was happening in the really complex supply chains. They wanted to work with illegal fishing, IUU fishing, and endangered species. They wanted to work with science to improve management of these resources. They want to work to eliminate modern slavery, reduce the use of antibiotics and plastics and greenhouse gas emissions. And they wanted to focus on sustainable growth of aquaculture, use new technologies, and invest substantially in innovation. So this is a very full agenda, and you could think that, well, these are big words, but are they actually ever going to deliver on these words? But anyway, we had an agenda for the future. We were excited about the outcomes of this meeting, and we realized that we need to take this further. So we were able to secure some funding from 3 philanthropy organizations in the US. We hosted a second meeting in Stockholm just a few months later in May of 2017, where we were able to define priorities and define how to work together over the coming years. So basically, by the middle of 2017, we had these 10 commitments for ocean stewardship. We had been able to identify 4 of those as priorities to start working with. One of the CEOs says that I'm going to be the leader of this. I can be an interim chairman, and I'm happy to work with the scientists to make sure that this agenda is being advanced. We had a couple of scientists who were able to help this transition from move towards to action, and we agreed to set up an interim secretariat to support the companies in this with the funding that we have received from these philanthropy organizations. And of course, having that money was instrumental. We didn't want money from the companies because we didn't want to work for them. We wanted to design this as a scientific experiment where, we were in charge of the science and we were independent and we didn't owe the company anything. And instead it was the companies that were indebted to us and the support that we provided to them. So since then, we have been working on a regular basis to develop this agenda and to develop operational activities, and also to make sure that the companies are producing results. Every year we have a meeting where all the operational staff of the different companies, the ones who are actually doing the jobs, meet, and they met for the first time in 2018 in Amersfoort. So by 2018, we also had a third CEO dialogue, this time in Karuizawa, outside of Tokyo in the mountains. So by the end of 2018, we had a whole range of operational people involved. We had a science team of about 7 or 8 people involved. All the companies have been engaged now at the CEO level. So there were people and money and resources and an agenda. By 2019, SeaBOS was starting to get a bit of a global recognition. Again, an additional working meeting and getting the CEOs together. And I think this has been really instrumental to get the CEOs to point out the strategic direction and then to have their staff working very closely with them. During 2020 and 2021, of course, we had challenges of meeting because of the pandemic, but we were still able to host 2 meetings, 2 big dialogues every year, and also multiple working group meetings in different task forces where we translate sort of promises to actions. In 2020, we were able to agree on a number of time-bound goals to make sure that the companies are not just promised that they should do something, they also promise when they should do it and how those results will be presented. In 2021, companies were starting to demonstrate some concrete results. And then last year, we were able to finally meet again. And we were also able to produce a progress report that we launched in July at the UN Ocean meeting in Portugal. So it's a long, lots of meetings and lots of people involved, and a big process, of course, to change these huge companies. But we're seeing some very substantial progress being made. And we're also seeing substantial commitment in all these companies, many times despite the fact that they've changed their CEOs multiple times, but still they are still going with this and developing this work further. This is another way to illustrate interactions over time. These are the different years, 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. Over time, you see the growth in the network connectivity. Each dot, again, is an individual, and the size of the dot is the number of the meetings that this individual has been part of. So here you have a little bit of a feeling for the growth over time. And this little light green dot is particularly interesting because that's now the formal secretariat of the SeaBOS group. It's now become much more of an institution. It's not scientists who are running the sort of the functionality of this initiative. It's a secretariat employed by a foundation, and it's a secretariat funded by the companies, which means that we as scientists don't have to coordinate everything. We can focus on developing the science to this. So it's becoming much more robust as an institution. So in 2022, I guess I could say 2023, SeaBOS is a legal entity. It has its own secretariat and its own funding. It's supported by independently funded scientists. We as scientists, we have received our fourth series of grants. So we are now sort of fully funded for another 3 years. It's starting to become recognized in the industry and in science. And it's starting to become a source of inspiration across different ocean sectors and also other sectors. The transport industry in Sweden has, for instance, engaged in similar kinds of dialogues with scientists to see what they can do together. So it's starting to inspire collective action, I think, to some extent. By now, 10 members are present. We have 2 more joining in 2017 and 18. And these companies, they have competitive advantages because they know what the agendas are and they know how to address it. They can learn faster than their peers. And they've also started to advocate together for science-based management of fisheries and aquaculture. They work together to make sure that the governments in Northeast Atlantic follow the scientific quotas. They have been advocating for a ban on harmful subsidies in the World Trade Organization. And they have been arguing for governments to ratify the port states measures agreements, another important UN agreement to address illegal fisheries. So they basically have new reputation. They're getting access to new funding, new markets, and are improving their credibility as actors. But of course, that credibility relies on the fact that they demonstrate concrete results, and they are increasingly starting to do so. Some of the actual results of what the companies have done, they have completed something that's called a materiality assessment. And that's a technical term for defining what you consider as important in your business. And then those are also the issues that you work with. So if you consider antibiotics material to your business, you have to work on materiality. And these assessments have been done according to the best available standards, which means that the companies are much more ambitious in their sustainability agenda. They're now also all reporting with the best available standards. More of them are being transparent about their production volumes. And all of them have set a number of ambitious goals for several of these challenges. And last year, they started to report on that. And next year or this year, they're also continuing to report on the progress that they have made. They also have all set climate goals, and that's something that very few of them had set in the beginning. So these are a small concrete examples of what has happened, but I think primarily what has happened is that we've seen how the companies are starting to push each other to become more ambitious and starting to challenge each other to be better than they used to be, which is really exciting. Just wrapping this up, this is an illustration of this, the operation of this organization. You have like the 10 different companies here. They are members of a SeaBOS association, where you define the rules for how do you get new members and how do you expel members and what's the processes for that. And they also pay their contribution to the SeaBOS Fundraising Foundation that employs the secretariat, that coordinates work in all these different task forces where we focus on specific issues. And then you have the scientists here who are funded by these philanthropy trusts, develop the agenda. And our job is to help companies develop knowledge and understanding of how to address these challenges, while also evaluating whether or not these companies are actually helping change the entire industry, and if so, how that could be done. And then this foundation here is partly managed by scientists and industry and independent people together. So it's like a bridging function here between these organizations. And here you have just the logos of the different companies. So I think in addition to what we have done internally with the companies to get them more involved in these issues, there's also a whole range of political and corporate sector change when it comes to the ocean. The ocean sustainability is becoming much more central to the political agendas, with lots of things happening over this time period. The ocean is becoming much more central to corporate agendas, and ocean sustainability is much more recognized as key for global sustainability. So of course, if companies have worked on this already since 2016, they're ahead of many of their competitors who may be starting these issues just the last year or so. So I think this is my last slide, where what we have learned is to have this shared vision of developing ocean stewardship. It's an unclear term, but it's something that's exciting, that people realize that you have to work together to develop it and understand what it is, and to have a long-term perspective and develop trust has been really instrumental. Learning is not just scientists teaching companies, it's really learning multiple directions between companies and from companies to science. So we really need a range of different capacities, because from different scientific disciplines, from different regions, and we also need to understand each other and sort of the different cultures in which we operate, both sort of academic or corporate cultures, but also regional geographical cultures. But it's starting to generate results. There's lots more work to do, but it's really nice to see that it's starting to inspire others, and others want to follow suit. What we're also doing is we're not just working with the companies, we're also connecting to these political and corporate developments to make sure that we have an exchange of information and understand what's happening in the context around the company, so that we can help shape the agenda on sustainability for the ocean going forward. I think it's very clear that this is not, it's a bit of an unusual way for scientists to work, and it's also very uncomfortable work to do. When we started, many were very skeptical, saying that you're wasting your time, it's just going to be greenwashing, it's not going to result in anything. It is resulting in something, but it still makes it very uncomfortable to do this. And it makes the companies uncomfortable too, which I think is nice. And everyone is uncomfortable, but also very excited. But we treat it as an experiment, and everyone is interested in the experiment succeeding, but we also want to be objective and careful in our interpretation of the results. So that means that we have to document and listen and reflect and publish the insights on how far we have come, but also the challenges that we are facing along the way. So yeah, you can ask, of course, what does this have to do with peace? I think obviously cooperation is the opposite of conflict. And and conflict is a lot of times a failure to communicate. And I think we've learned a lot how to communicate across these different cultures that we are operating in. But it's also really clear that when you start collaborating with people, and in particular people that you'd never collaborated with before, you realize that lots of unexpected and interesting things can happen, and people start learn and mimic from each other, and can expand their perspective and do things that they have never done before. So yeah, I think it's so collaboration really is a way to promote peaceful stewardship and a better relationship between people and planet. Yeah, so here's just a slide of some of the amazing people who's been working on this for so many years, and I'm really grateful for their taking the time and engaging in this, and also risking their careers in the process of doing so. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Henrik, for truly an inspiring journey, I would say, and for walking us through since the inception of the project, and now showing us the concrete results of this experimentation, the results of which definitely have real life impacts on many of the actors involved in the project. And if I may also add on the slide about peace, I think it's also interesting to look at this type of stewardship, ocean stewardship, for example, in regions where there's political tensions or geopolitical tensions, right? Like South China Sea, maybe in areas where state capacity to really govern the oceans, like Somalia, for example, maybe that could be also linked to this ocean stewardship, and then therefore have a stronger implication for international peace and security. Thank you. So for our attendees, again, if you have your questions anytime, just type in the chat box or in the Q&A function. And if you want to ask your question yourself, we're very happy to enable your microphone, or I can also, I think I can make you a panelist in that case. All right. We just had our first question, and this is from actually my colleague here, Professor Ayub Sharifi of Hiroshima University. And he said that it's a very interesting approach, and he wants to know if it was challenging to get corporate representatives engaged in the workshops. And if so, what were the main challenges and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I think a lot of the times when you want to engage companies in sustainability, you think, well, let's talk to the most well-known company who has a reputation for being sustainable, and let's talk to the corporate sustainability person there, because that company, that person will clearly be an ally, and we've been at the same meetings anyway, and I saw him or her, so I can reach out and engage that person. Our case was a little bit different, because we thought, well, who has the power? And let's talk to the person in power in the most powerful company. So we identified some of the companies. Two of the largest ones were Japanese, and at that time, their engagement in sustainability was quite limited, and mostly also, not so internationally known, because the work was also in Japanese. And we wanted to engage the CEOs of the Japanese companies. At that time, we had no idea who to talk to. We had no connections to the Japanese companies, and despite the fact that we had several colleagues who worked in Japan, they too did not have any entry points into the Japanese companies. So basically, the challenge was that we have no idea who to talk to or where to even start. When I did my first interviews with some Japanese companies, I had a colleague at the OECD Secretariat for Fisheries in Paris, and he knew a person who knew a person who knew a person who knew a person who worked at that company. And I was through that sort of chain of connections able to get an introduction to see an individual at this large Japanese company. That was still not the CEO, but that was just the first example of how challenges it was to get some of the data. In the Japanese context then, eventually we approached the Swedish ambassador to Japan, Magnus Rubak, who engaged one of his Japanese colleagues, Kasumi Appleyard, who's been incredibly helpful in getting the Japanese companies involved. So the Swedish ambassadors, with the help of Kasumi-san, organized 3 lunch seminars at the embassy, where basically the CEOs never participated there, but Japanese company representatives participated there and were able to communicate our invitation to this first and also to the second dialogues that we hosted in the Maldives and in Stockholm. So I think it was very, very challenging to get corporation involved, and we had to use lots of different methods to engage the CEOs. The embassy in Japan was instrumental again. Some of these other Japanese, so the Korean companies, we had to engage a colleague who had worked for the UN system, and in Norway we had to engage an individual who knew some of these CEOs. So it was always like to get an ambassador of some sort that could introduce us and that could tell the CEOs that you should have a conversation with these scientists because I trust them, and you trust me, so you should trust them. So lots of sort of informal, half an hour breakfast at an airport, a dinner in Seoul, but always facilitated by somebody who was able to be that bridge, because we didn't know how to engage with these companies, but we had people who supported that. So to build relationships with credible ambassadors was the strategy that helped. I think what also helped is that we had a scientific analysis at the basis. So we had, we have data, and we have identified you as an important actor. Let us tell you why you are important and what we think that means. So to be sort of credible scientists with some new science to communicate, and also to be introduced by somebody who was legitimate in the eyes of the CEO was instrumental. Some of the CEOs, we try to connect with them, and we just failed miserably. We're just not able to get connected. So this was really the most difficult part in this entire project, I think, just to get that first conversation.
Thank you,
Sorry,
Henrik.
long answer, but this took us 2 years to make this happen.
Yeah, truly fascinating. And even I'm very curious about all the other moving parts of this long journey from the beginning. But we have here another question by Rohan George, also of Hiroshima University. And he said, thank you for sharing the details of your important initiative. And his question is it possible for the end consumers, individuals like us, to identify the source of their seafood? After working in the private sector for a number of years, corporations usually react quickly and most effectively to changes from their clients or customers, rather than changes in the regulatory framework. Henrik.
Yeah, thanks. This is also a really good question. For some of the consumer-facing brands, this is super important. I mean, the references I made to investigative journalism's uncovering human rights abuses in the seafood sector in Japan, that was incredibly important for Thai Union, big consumer-facing brand, and with lots of big sort of tuna brands in the US that are household names. So when Thai Union was exposed as sort of related to these human rights abuses, they immediately had to do something. Some of the other companies that we work with here are they own companies that own companies. So you don't really know who they are if you're not, if you're from Japan, you know what Nisui is, but if you're, in the US, you know what Peter Pan is. You don't know if it's owned by Nisui or Marua, you never care. So you have these kind of layers of filters, I guess, that makes consumer impacts less felt at sort of the corporate ownership level. But I think what's really interesting is this rapid move towards traceability of ocean resources, and if there's a risk of illegal fishing, if there's a risk of modern slavery, if there's a risk of overuse of antibiotics in some of your supply somewhere, you need to know where that problem lies, and you need to know how to trace it, and you need to know how to isolate it. So you need to know how to sort of figure out that, well, we're going to shut down this supplier, or we're going to fix this problem here. So this increased crisis awareness is creating a drive for increased traceability, so you can track actually from the boat to your plate. And also that's being facilitated by novel technologies and lots of new science that's going into traceability of seafood, and also interoperability between different traceability systems, so that if you're working in Europe or Japan or North America, you can sort of have traceability system that goes across these different supply chains. So I think, is it possible for the end consumers to identify the source of their seafood? To some extent, yes, in very few examples today, but I think increasingly this will become much more of a mainstream thing for you to be able to do with this development of new technologies, and hopefully to some extent at least by these 10 companies really wanting to engage further in both developing the technology and also using it. We've had trials that run by some of the companies where you have cameras on board that's connected to technologies that you can basically understand what's being caught and who was on that boat, and then you can have information translated throughout the entire supply chain from Mexico to Tokyo or wherever your fish ends up. So I think we're getting there. We're not there yet. There are a couple of sort of miniature examples of really well traced seafood in sort of niche markets, but I think that's becoming much more available, hopefully in the years to come, so that you actually know who caught what, when, where, and how.
It's good that there's some kind of optimism behind there, and I actually echo Rohan's question here, because many of us would love to make sustainable and ethical choices. It's just that sometimes information are either not available or maybe difficult, or maybe we just don't have the time, for example, to find out those information. So it's good to know that there's some progress in terms of this. Thank you, Henrik.
It's true. It's progress, but it's ridiculously slow. I mean, I have a PhD in marine science, and I still have a hard time buying seafood. I think that tells you something, that like if I think it's difficult, probably people who don't have that education think it's impossible. So I think it just needs to be much easier than it is today to make the right decisions.
Yeah, thank you. So we have here someone raised a question. Now I have promoted you to a panelist. If you could please make sure that you can speak to the microphone, turn on your microphone. Right, great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your very nice presentation. Actually, I'm also joining from Hiroshima University, and I'm coming from Afghanistan. So currently I'm doing my master in behavioral ecology as well. It was very interesting for me. And I'm also doing my research about the conflict between human and wildlife conflict in Hiroshima. So according to your presentation and very nice and very comprehensive details that you just shared, it was very interesting, and it's really inspired me to how to think for how to apply for different approach for making or for strengthening collaboration for having a sustainable or for having a sustainable future. So actually one things that sometimes I'm also worried about, that it is about how to bring or how to encourage the policymaker and the politicians to bring them for the collaboration of the coexistence, or to life in harmony with nature, or for conserving the ecosystem. I think it's seems a little bit difficult for me still. However, there is too many conventions or commitments, or we have lots of conferences at the UN levels, but still I think it's not taking very seriously for them to really making some policy for ecosystem conservation. So, Professor, I just want to ask you, is there any approach that you want to try, or you just consider to take in your future studies to bring them for as you said, from their word to action? So I think it's important, because the policymakers or the politicians, they're always talking about the ecosystem or the environmental issues, but for their action, it's still not their first priority. Thank you, Sensei. I hope that you can catch my question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this. It's a really important question. I mean, what we find is that the companies, they are so directly linked to the functioning of the ecosystem. So it's really, like I said, in their best interest to work with the planet. Some of these companies, they have been around for 100 years, and they intend to be around for another 100 years. And during this 100 years that they have been around, they have seen the depletion of resources, and they have experienced how difficult it is and how far they must go, or how deep they must go to catch these resources. So they are really living with the problems as they are developing. So they are, of course, accountable to their shareholders and dependent on ecosystems. Of course, it's quite well known that governments are accountable to their voters, and often they don't have a 100-year perspective, but rather, a 3 or 4 years perspective, which makes them yeah, gives them a bit of a different perspective, of course. And as a politician, it's quite easy to make promises and then you can blame 15 other reasons for why you weren't able to deliver because of all these other priorities that had to take precedence during that time, or it was the budget, or it was the inflation, or whatever it was. Some countries, I think, still are making promises that are not based on the sustainability of one government party or one part of government. In Sweden, we at least we agreed in Parliament in, can't remember when this was, like almost 20 years ago, to develop a set of generation goals to reach sustainability by 2025 or 2030. It doesn't mean that we're reaching these goals. There's still a long way to go, but at least to make political commitments that last beyond the individual sort of election period, I think is instrumental. To really get parliamentary decision and commitment for the longer term goals is instrumental. I think as scientists, we should do our best to engage with governments to the best of our ability. I've been working with something called the High Level Panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy, where 16 heads of states and governments really wanted to have science as a basis for the decision. And we were 250 scientists who were involved in developing scientific papers and support for this process. And we're able to help shape the conversation and the commitments made by the government. So did everything we could to help them, these governments, to have the best available science. And then they produced a really nice report with lots of big commitments and lots of big promises. And we were happy about that. But then, of course, a few months or just a few weeks later, after this report, one of the leading governments, in this case, it was Norway, talked a lot about sustainability. And then they opened up lots of new oil and gas licenses in their own economic zones. And then, of course, we did not just want to sit still and be silent and be happy about the fact that they listened to us once. But then we published a paper saying that we don't trust Norway anymore. Look how they are now being sort of dishonest to their own promise. So I think we as scientists, we should help governments to the best of our ability to make sure that they commit to the right priorities. But when they don't, and when they are clearly not consistent, we should also not be afraid of publicly naming and shaming governments and to hold them accountable to their promises. And I think so help government as much as you can, but let the world know when they are not keeping to their promises. And like some of my colleagues and me, we've also been publishing on the Swedish lack of commitment on sustainability with a new turn of government. So I think we should always help, and we should never be afraid to speak up when we're not happy about governments. Of course, this is easier in some countries than others, but I think it's really important to figure out ways in which we as scientists can hold governments accountable and not just be happy that they're listening to us, but also force them to stick to their promises with the few means that we have at our disposals.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. I got my answer question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Österblom. So now I'm going to change you back to an attendee. Thank you. Yeah, I think something related to that, Henrik, too, is the political context, at least at the national level, of where these companies are in. For example, in Japan, at least since the publication of the SDGs in 2015, I think Japan is somehow posturing itself to be a global leader in achieving the SDGs. Do you think that has some, I think, influence or convincing power for some of the Japanese companies to be on board to your experimentation, even though I don't know how many Japanese companies said no to your initiative? What do you think of that?
I think absolutely. It has a fundamental influence on the companies. So we have all three companies identified, the Japanese companies are now very actively involved in this collaboration. And when on the one hand, when the Japanese government's committed to sort of reduction of carbon emissions, and when they announced that they need all sectors of the Japanese society to set climate-related goals, all three Japanese companies immediately started to develop to set these goals. It was like a given. We don't have an option. We have to set a climate-related target. Then, of course, there was push from the other SeaBOS companies as well to do so. But I think that, I mean, it's nice to have companies to take voluntary actions, but without government regulations, it's not going to amount to much. I mean, we cannot rely on the private sector solving these things. We really need to have force from governments through regulations and through other kinds of commitments. So the Japanese commitment to be a leader in sustainability clearly forced the Japanese companies to be more ambitious, but it also made them more comfortable to feel that it's good for us to be forced, because we're getting force from the SeaBOS companies as well. And you can see now the Japanese companies who from the beginning were a bit almost shy, or sort of really didn't speak up very much, or didn't have a very sort of strong government push or consumer push or internal domestic push on these issues, now feel that they were so early to start with these issues. So they have an enormous self-confidence now when they speak for a Japanese audience, because they know that they are doing the right thing, and that they know that they're 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of their competition. So when I go to seminars now in Tokyo with these companies, they are really proud and really vocal about what they are saying. And like a couple of years ago, they were very quiet and reluctant to speak out. So I think they have really grown in self-confidence, and that self-confidence also comes from the signal by the Japanese government that this is what you have to do and this is what you expect you to do, but also to be happy about, well, we're almost already doing it. So I think, yeah, so that's a really exciting development.
Yeah, exactly the kind of unexpected collaborations that maybe, as you've mentioned, some of the skeptics who would think that this is just greenwashing, but now.
Yeah, but it also goes the other way. I mean, the 3 Japanese companies are really sort of challenged by antibiotics overuse. So what they are doing now is that they are collaborating together to go to the Japanese government to say, can't you develop more regulations and stronger political force on antibiotics, so that all our competitors will also have to be ambitious when it comes to reducing antibiotics. So you also get sort of positive push from companies for governments to be ambitious. So hopefully governments can become more bold in their commitments if they feel that companies want that kind of political commitment.
Thank you, Henrik. I hope we can hear more about this fascinating project, but sad to say we're now ran out of time. But thank you for all our attendees. NERPS is really committed to transdisciplinary projects. And I think this is an epitome of the kind of project that we want to highlight in our network and also in this webinar series. So thank you so much, Henrik. But before we close, I just want to take this opportunity to share with our attendees that we have our second NERPS conference this year in Thailand from February 28 to March 3. And it's jointly organized with the Asian Institute of Technology. And we have at least 35 sessions on different topics covering SDGs, but all of these topics from different disciplines actually are all connected to peace and sustainability. Although the deadline for abstract submission is now over, but non-presenting participants can still register until February 21. So for more details, you can visit our website. Maybe I will type in the chat box later on our website, and also the website for the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where you can find our conference updates and also future activities of NERPS. And also, if you're not following us yet, you can connect with us through social media, different social media platforms. Thank you, Henrik, so much for your time today, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you to our attendees for your participation. To those who raised the question, thank you so much. If you have other questions about this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us through our website, and also our email is in that website. Thank you everyone for your time, and I hope to see you in our future events and initiatives. Thank you.
Thanks much. Bye-bye.